Good morning. My name is Matthew Rink. I'm a reporter here at the Erie Times News and GoErie.com. Thank you for joining us today for this special Facebook Live discussion about child poverty in Erie County. On Sunday, March 11th, we reported these troubling facts. In Erie County, 1 in 4 children live in poverty. The problem is even worse in the city of Erie, where 40% of children are in poverty. Despite years of work and millions of dollars spent on anti-poverty initiatives, there has not been any discernible trend in census data to show that conditions are improving. In other words, the needle has not moved. Joining me today to continue this discussion is Bill Jackson, President of the United Way of Erie County. Bill, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
So, first question is, what impact does it have on a child to grow up in a low-income home or impoverished environment?
Well, one of the first things we need to understand is that a very large percentage of the wiring of a child's brain happens within their first 5 years, as much as 90%. And recent studies are showing that by age 3, most of that has actually been occurring. And what that means is, the ability for that brain to learn in the future is affected by the environment that they're in the early stages. And so stimulation of the child is very important. And one key stimulation is verbal stimulation. And there was a study done a few years ago that said comparing a low-income household to wealthier households, there is as much as a 30 million word gap in the number of words that child hears from the low-income household to the wealthier household. And not only that, but the percentage of those words that are encouraging versus discouraging. The children in the low-income household is hearing more discouraging words. Now, we're quick to note that we're not blaming the parents for this. This is a function of the environment that is going on. And in fact, it is likely that the parents had that same background when they were younger.
Okay.
But so when you think about the impact on the child, their future ability to learn and interact is so much impacted by what happens in those first few years. And unfortunately, science is telling us and economics is telling us that lower income households, children in lower income households, are at a disadvantage in something like that. So that's just one example.
Okay. What factors in Erie have contributed to our high poverty rate?
Well, of course, we seem to have a decrease in the number of family-sustaining jobs. The economy, the local economy, which there are a lot of good signs of how that might be turning around in the future, but the situation we're in right now is a function of what has happened in the past. Secondly is education. We have a relatively low educational attainment rate in Erie County compared to other communities, and I think everyone understands that education ties in with, there's a strong correlation between level of education and level of income that someone can make in their lifetime. And then, as you noted in your article on Sunday, a high percentage of single-family heads of households is an issue. And again, there are many single parents who do a fantastic job, but statistically speaking, on average, a child is better off if they have more adult influence in their lives.
So what approaches have not worked? Why are we still in this position today in Erie County?
Yeah, well, and we at United Way asked ourselves that same question a few years ago, and the answer we came up with is that while we have a number of programs that do good work, the problem is we're not doing it in a collective fashion and really changing community conditions. So it's been sort of a Band-Aid approach, and what we need to do is be working together more.
When you talk about that Band-Aid approach, has there been more of a focus on meeting the immediate needs of people who are in poverty as opposed to the long-term work of breaking the cycle of generational poverty?
Yeah, that, plus the fact that even if you are helping an individual or a family break that cycle within their family, it's helping that person, but it's not helping the greater community good. So, we can point to thousands of folks that have been helped, but yet we have thousands more filling in right behind them because we're not getting to the root of the issue.
So what strategies do you think work? And if you could just discuss those, what is working and what path are we on?
Well, definitely when we talk about what works, and as I think I was just alluding to, We're talking about what works to break the cycle, not what works to help this individual family. So, not to cast aspersions on the many great programs and folks that help, people today. But as we're saying, what we need to do is to work collectively. And I think the key to it is understanding that it's not just the social service sector's problem, or it's not just government's job to solve this. This takes the entire community coming together. And I think that's the thing we're really starting to see, is that as business and government and faith community and just average people are starting to understand, not only does it take all of us to do something about it, but that we can impact this.
Yeah, that's one thing I wanted to ask is what are the limitations of the United Way? I mean, obviously you talk about issues like the lack of family-sustaining jobs.
Right.
Well, you're not a job creator, you're not a business.
Right.
You discuss the issue of, I think in Erie County, it's 39% of children live in a single-parent household. Obviously, that has a great impact on our poverty rates. What are the limitations of what you do at the United Way?
Well, obviously there are limitations. We only do so much, and so that's one of the reasons we say it takes all of us. But what we've been realizing over the last few years is not so much about our limitations, but actually what we can do beyond our traditional role. Because in the past, when you think about our over 100-year history in this community, most of that time we felt our mission was to raise as much money as we could in the community and then allocate it out to agencies doing good work. And in fact, it was a limited, small number of agencies doing good work. And what we came to understand is that we can look at this issue beyond just raising money. What can we do to convene? What can we do to mobilize volunteers? We can advocate. And so I'm sure we're going to talk about community schools in a little bit, and that's a perfect example of how United Way is not just about writing a check anymore.
Yeah, discuss that a little bit. I know when we talked before, you went all the way back to 1998. That's 20 years ago. Tell me a little bit about how things evolved for your agency.
Since you asked, it was in 1998 we had a strategic planning session with our board, and to make the long story short, the question was, we really need to decide who we're in business for. Are we in business for the donor? Are we in business for the agencies we raise money for? Or are we in business for the community? Obviously knowing we need donors and agencies to raise money and do the work. And at that point, our board said, we have to be in business for the community. That's our purpose. Yet we need, as I said, agencies and donors. But the second question was, back in 1998, how are we structured? How do we act? How do we make decisions? And the answer was, we make decisions based on as if we're in business for the agencies. And 3 years later, we came back and asked that same question, and we said, we haven't changed anything. We don't know how to be in business for the community directly. We know how to be in business to raise money for agencies, and it's really taken us...
That was the original concept of the United Way back, I think, in 1914.
Well, again, it was certainly in 1914, what was done for the benefit of the community, but it was seen as what's good for the community is getting money to these agencies.
And so now we've got hundreds, there's probably probably couldn't even count how many nonprofit agencies are raising money for their causes in the community.
Right.
So 2015, you start to see a change, or you start to make a change in the approach. Let's talk about community schools, because I know that's when you were kind of introduced to that model. Was it a school? Schools out in Salt Lake City, Utah?
Yeah, well, what we did was we were looking for a better way to allocate the dollars that we were raising. Up until that point, we were kind of looking at it as almost a peanut butter approach, spreading it around to as many places as possible. And again, that contributed to the Band-Aid thinking. That contributed to the idea that we can help that person, but can we really raise the community? And so we looked at one of the advantages of being the United Way is we have over 1,000 of them throughout the U.S., so we can look and see who else is doing what. We don't have to reinvent the wheel here. That's when we came up with community schools. I think the first that we looked at were Salt Lake City, but we've talked to folks in Cleveland, we've talked to folks in Baltimore, and we've become very close with the folks in the Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania, basically the Allentown, Bethlehem area, who have been at this work for a while now. So A, we didn't invent it, we've found it's something that works elsewhere, and B, we have a very good, strong network of support to help us do it right the first time.
What have those communities seen in terms of tackling some of these issues we're talking about?
Right. Yeah. And For those who don't know what a community school is, just real basically, the simple answer is you take services and supports for kids and families and neighbors and bring them into the school rather than having people go hither and yon for them. But you do it in an aligned way, so it isn't just bringing in good work. You find out what's needed in that particular area by talking with the families and the students and the teachers, and then bringing those services in. So quick, Reader's Digest on what a community school is. And what we've been told is that the first things that we're going to see, and it takes some time, you can't flip a switch, but the first kinds of things we're going to see is improvement in children's behavior and attendance. Those things lead to eventually improvement in academic performance, because obviously if a child's not in school, they can't learn. If they're being disruptive or being disrupted by others, it's very difficult to learn. So if we can improve that behavior and that attendance for starters, then eventually we're going to see improvement in the academic performance.
So you adopted this approach here in Erie County, and in 2016 was the start of that, correct?
Yeah.
What have you learned so far? What have you seen so far?
Well, the first thing that we learned is that once people understand what this really means, and it takes more than my just 1 minute explanation to really understand what it is, they get excited about it. And when I say people, I'm talking about teachers, students, families, parents. They get excited about it because they can see that this makes a lot of sense, and it's a very inclusive model. So we're actively soliciting the voice of the parent, of the neighbor, of the child, of the teacher. And it's also a shared leadership model, which that's very hard. That's one of the things that you learn quickly is that you're going to have bumps in the road. But the good news is if everybody around the table is committed toward the outcome, and the outcome is the children's success, then we've learned how to work together. But I think the biggest hurdle is making sure that people really understand what it is, what the model is, how it works.
So do you have any specific success stories? I know that when we met a few weeks ago, one of the things that you guys talked about from United Way was connecting some families whose children didn't have a mattress to sleep on, and working. Can you just discuss some of those things that you've found so far that have worked?
Yeah. Well, that example was a local furniture store had a number of mattresses available or beds available, and they were trying to find out what's the best way to get them to people that can really use them and can need them. Well, the nice thing about the community school model is each school has a person called the community school director, and one big part of their job is to know and understand the families and what their needs are. And so we were able to connect those families with that resource, pretty much that afternoon. Another success, because when we talk to educators, one of the things that they cite as sometimes being problematic is parental engagement. And so, having parents show up for parent-teacher conferences or for various events that the school might have. And what we found is that with that community school director making those connections, we've seen significant improvements in terms of increases of the number of parents showing up for these kinds of things. And again, that's an important big first step.
Right. So what's the future of the community schools model? What's next? I know you just added 2 schools this past December.
We're in the process of adding, yeah. So the first 5 schools were in the city, just because that's the way it worked out. But we announced we're going to be starting a community school in the Iroquois Elementary School and in Elk Valley Elementary in Girard. And it's really just a matter of as resources become available, because it takes some dollars to make this work, we can eventually get out to more schools. Ideally, in a perfect world, every school, elementary through high school, would be a community school. We'll get there when we can get there. We're starting with a combination of the schools that have a high need and that we can provide the resources to get them going.
Okay, very good. So those efforts obviously focus, on breaking the cycle of poverty, focusing on children. But for somebody who's suffering, a parent who may be suffering through poverty right now, who needs some help, what programs are available to help them? Whether that's the United Way or another agency. I know that is another aspect of what you're doing is self-sufficiency. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, certainly. And again, the Erie region is blessed with a large number of good programs that help people. You might be talking about food pantries or housing assistance, utility assistance, those kinds of needs that come up. One of the problems we've had in the past is that if someone doesn't know where to turn, how do they know where to turn?
Right.
And they end up making 6, 7, 8 phone calls before they find the right resource, if they manage to hang in there that long before they give up. Last May, we brought 211 to Erie County. It's a phone number. It's non-emergency services. So you call 911 for fire, medical, and police emergencies. But for non-emergency needs, like the ones I mentioned, housing, etc., call 211. You're connected with a resource navigator who has a database of all of these services throughout Erie County, and in fact, it's a statewide effort. And they're trained to talk to you if you call in, because if you say, you know, my electric just got shut off, I have a problem there. Okay, well here are some things you can do to look at that. But if your electric's shut off, that resource navigator understands that you may have other issues going on. So, by the way, and they're trained to ask the next leading question. So not only help you with that presenting problem, but also other things that are going on in your life that weren't the issue of the day, but they're an issue tomorrow, and how can we help you with that? So we were very excited to bring this service to Erie County. It's one of the last portions in the state to receive the 911 service, and it's 24/7, 365. We've had over 4,000 phone calls since May when it was launched. And in fact, one of the big successes was the big snow that came at Christmas time. And when the county worked with Team Rubicon to come in and help elderly and disabled folks with that, 211 was the phone number to call to connect them. So we were very happy to have that available for our community.
Okay, very good. I want to jump back to the funding issue, obviously.
Really quick, we have a question.
Okay.
Somebody said, what about the community college that was once discussed? I'm going to assume that's in relation to what you were kind of just talking about, but I'm not really.
Okay. Well, sometimes people confuse community schools with community college. They're two completely different things.
Right.
Sure. Community college is something that United Way supports in terms of our board has said we think we need a community college, but it's not something we're actively participating in or funding.
Right. Okay, back to you, Matt.
Yeah, back to the issue of funding.
Mm-hmm.
Earlier this year or late last year, I think there were about 28 agencies that have been funded in the past that were notified that they're not going to receive any additional funding after June 30th. I think it's about $700,000. Obviously, that was probably a tough decision to make, but can you kind of take us through why that decision was made and how it kind of aligns with what you're doing now, what that focus is now?
Absolutely, and let me say that most of those agencies, we had made them aware of this pending change for a few years, so that wasn't a surprise. There were a few that kind of came up differently, but most of that had been known. And as I said before, in the past, our idea was to get the money out to as many agencies as possible, and that peanut butter spreading approach. The approach now is to say, let's make sure those dollars are working as effectively as possible, and the idea of having collective impact rather than this isolated impact that had been going on. So what we did was we identified student success from birth and family stability as the two key areas that going forward we will support. It's called a two-generation approach because you can help the student, but if they're going home to a family that's in disarray, you've got issues there. And so it's not, when we talk about community schools, some people I think misunderstand and think that all we're talking about is helping a kid succeed in school, when it's really about helping the entire family succeed, and including their basic needs. So that's all a piece of it. It's a need to get laser focused, and it's also a recognition that at least it's not just in Erie, it's throughout the country, but particularly in Erie, we've had declines in the workplace giving. Because there's been declines in the jobs in the workplace.
Sure.
If you don't have a job, very difficult to give. We've seen increases in other kinds of revenue. Our Imagination Library, for example, has been very successful raising money outside of the workplace. So, we don't have an issue of raising money. The issue we have is raising money for discretionary things. When you raise money for the Imagination Library, it has to go to the Imagination Library. When you raise money on general contribution in the workplace, then our volunteers determine where that money goes. And we've had a significant decline in the dollars available. And so, again, rather than just reducing everyone, what we did was we picked and chose those areas that we think will have the best impact moving forward. And one misunderstanding I think that people have had is that they think we don't give money to agencies at all anymore, which is not the case. We give money to many agencies and will continue to in the future. It's just a different focus.
Okay.
We have another question
Okay, we
here
have
too.
another question.
And this one is kind of broad. I think she's referring specifically to herself. But Bill, where are we supposed to get help for getting on our feet if we have tried everything? I have went through all programs and we're still in poverty. Where can I go?
So, that is a broad question.
Yeah,
and it's
right.
kind of hard to answer. And obviously my first answer to that is to call 211. But if that's, if that hasn't helped, then I would say really need to get in touch with someone of a case manager nature who understand. Without understanding all the details of the situation, it's very difficult to tell someone specifically what to do. I would, I hope this doesn't sound cliche, but don't give up.
I want to jump back to the funding issue. A question that we got from a reader this week, and this is from Art Leopold. He had asked, and I'll just read the whole thing. Childhood poverty springs from a parent or caregiver in poverty. Assistance with adult training, education, job placement, family sustaining jobs for the parents is key to success. The schools, whether they be public, private, trade schools, specialized schools, or even a community college in the future, or just your standard college, are tasked with education opportunities. We have public and private job placement centers. Neighborhood community centers for minority, new American, and marginalized populations are key to adult and family stability. Why are we reducing or eliminating funding for the neighborhood centers at a time when they are needed most? Is that something you can answer?
Sure. Well, first of all, we are working with the neighborhood centers within the community school model.
Okay.
And services to adults is part of the community school model. It's not just for the kids. What we've seen in other communities is exactly the kinds of programs that this gentleman is referring to become offered within the school, or it could be still within the neighborhood center, but funded through the community school model. So we're not saying, when I say we, United Way is not saying that we don't want to fund neighborhood centers anymore. What we're saying is we want to fund the kinds of services delivered in a way that makes sense, and we want to include and have included the neighborhood centers in this planning.
Do we have any other audience questions?
Does Erie have a crisis center?
A crisis center.
I'm trying to think of what would be most relevant.
Depending on what type of crisis.
Yeah, that's true. I'm not sure if the audience heard that. Depending on what type of crisis, there are a number of different crisis hotlines. And again, I keep coming back to 211. It sounds kind of a broken record, but that's who you call to find answers to those kinds of questions.
Back to you.
We've talked about family sustaining jobs. Given I think there's a lot of economic uncertainty in Erie County right now. It's fair to say, especially with a company like GE Transportation. They've already cut a couple thousand jobs. We don't know what the future holds for them here in the community. Should we expect the problem to get worse before it gets better in terms of poverty?
The answer is that it's going to take probably a generation to make significant measurable improvement in the poverty rates to really turn the corner. So, and it's really hard to say short term what will happen next year or 2 or 3 or 5 years from now. But we are extremely optimistic, both because of what we see going on in the economy with the things like the Downtown Development Corporation, the expansion of the medical centers, Erie Insurance putting up that huge facility that's going to house 1,000 jobs, when they get all is said and done. And I'm sure Joel Duderman's project,
Sure.
Velocity, and on and on. But those things take time. And what we're thinking is that, that's going to require a qualified workforce, which means it's going to require kids that are properly educated, which means the community school work that we're doing and the other work that we're supporting is actually on the upstream of all of those fantastic things. But, it's going to take 10, 15, 20 years to actually see that measurable result. Will the numbers be worse next year than they are this year? There's no way I can predict that, but we're not looking short term.
What do we, as a community, do we have the will to see through that change long term? Do we have the patience to wait that long? Or are people going to come in and say we need to try something else? The needle isn't moving.
I'm very optimistic about that. I think, I've been at United Way for a little over 20 years, and by far, this is the most optimistic I felt about our community's willingness to work together. We talked earlier about the need for the entire community to come together and to take their role, and to understand that it's not about one person or one agency, it's about the results in the community. It is the improvement in that attitude and that willingness to work together. You can touch it, you can feel it. That makes me very optimistic that we will. Will there be bumps in the road? Yeah. Will there be times, when we question? I'm sure. It's hard. If it wasn't hard, it would have been done by now.
Things that are out of your control.
Yeah, it's extra macro things. But will it be better than it would have been had we not done this work? I'm convinced of that.
Very good.
A lot of people are asking questions about that have newborns, like infants, and somebody just asked something about CCIS. How does United Way work? I mean, with young kids, like baby kids.
Sure. So in a number of ways, one of the things is we support the Success by Six initiative in Erie. That is a program directly working with those who work with the children, including very young. When you mentioned CCIS, to connect folks with that kind of service and support. We have just announced at our annual meeting last month something called the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, which is a community-wide campaign. It's aimed at getting kids prepared so they're reading at grade level by the end of third grade. That's a key. But what we understand is that starts from birth. So there are elements of that plan that begin with healthy birth up through being able to read at the end of third grade. So our work is to help facilitate the work of those who actually deal with directly with the populations, and that's just a couple of the ways that we'll do that.
And Bill, I don't know if you can answer this question either, but somebody said something earlier. Do you understand that making poor adults feel guilty about their poverty and how they raise their kids will make them more resistant to seeking help? And somebody chimed in and said, my caseworker often makes me feel guilty. How do you cultivate a culture that kind of, really goes against that?
Well, and that's a really good question, a very good point to be made. It's one of the reasons, when we talked about a 30 million word gap, we stressed that we don't blame the parents for that. That's a very real issue, and I think that's something that is just going to take some time and education. No magic bullet there, but I recognize and understand that is an issue, yes.
Okay, Bill, anything else you want people to know? These people keep kind of chiming in with their own personal situations. I don't think anything that you can really address, but anything else you want people to know just about your efforts or anything we haven't talked about today?
Well, I think the important thing to understand is that we are part of an effort that you can see popping up throughout our community of organizations understanding the need to work differently. And so I think obviously we need to be hopeful about that, but we can't sit back and hope. And so there are any number of ways that people can get involved by volunteering, by checking in with, and it doesn't have anything to do with United Way. We use the phrase live united, and that really just means thinking of the community as something that you should be part of and contributing to. And there are any number of ways to do that, coaching a child's team, volunteering at church, whatever it may be. So I think the last word I want to say is just ask everyone to somehow be part of the solution.
Very good. Bill, I appreciate you being here
Thanks
today and taking the time.
Yep.
Thank you.